Thank you, Judy. Welcome everyone to our April lecture on the archetype of death and two fairy tales. We welcome back our guest speaker today, Kornelia Grabinska, a Jungian analyst in private practice in Fairbanks, Alaska. Her focus will be on the difference between the encounters with death in the Grimm's fairy tale and in a Polish fairy tale, and in the relationship between death and the human protagonists. Examples from other dreams and fairy tales will also be explored. The tales suggest that the human psyche can view death as an archetypal God image in preparation for the final encounter. Kornelia Grabinska was born and raised in Poland and received her analytic training from the Research and Training Center for Depth Psychology in Zurich. She has written and presented on such topics as Jungian interpretation of Inuit folk tales and the symbolism of death in alchemy and dreams. Kornelia has lived, practiced, and taught in Alaska for 30 years. She was instrumental in founding the C.G. Jung Society of Northern Alaska more than a decade ago, which offers conferences, lectures, and workshops on Jungian topics. So on the subject of the two fairy tales, Godfather Death and Godmother Death, welcome Kornelia Grabinska.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to the board members for inviting me. And thank you all of you to attend this presentation. So let me see if I will try the share screen and how that goes. Can you see anything or?
Yeah, we see all the slides at once. Yeah. You need to go to slideshow and then start slideshow. Go to slideshow on the. There you go. That's it. You got it.
Okay, great. Well, you have seen this painting of Beksiński. It was on the page of introduction of announcements. And I just wanted to point out this tiny figure of the human carrying the light. And this painting doesn't have a title, but to me, it seems that this man, this human, is going through a narrow passage. To me, it seems like a gauntlet of death. Perhaps he's on the way to Hades. You can see these forbidding giant figures looking down at him as though perhaps they are just witnessing his passage. It is clearly a difficult type of experience to find oneself in. And this human, we can sort of say that this human is bringing light of consciousness into the unconscious. As I continue my clinical work over the years and decades, as we move in time, the nature of our journey clarifies. Sometimes the question is not stated directly, but it is always present in the background, frequently expressed as, how can we manage the aging process? How can we orient ourselves in this phase of life? I hope the material I present today will aid our psychological understanding regarding this aspect of our life. In recent years, I have presented a series of dreams of a woman approaching death as a natural outcome of an aging process. It made sense for me to look at fairy tales to see what language, imagery, and wisdom they have to offer to us. Jung wrote that myth contains quotation mark revelations of the preconscious psyche and involuntary statements about unconscious psychic happenings. This can also be extended to fairy tales and dreams. In general, people notice their dreams. They're curious about them, even if they don't give much credence to them. Dreams offer a different perspective on life. They are direct communication from the unconscious. So I am linking mythologies and fairy tales with the language of dreams. And here is a quote from Jung, and Jung is talking about his concept of what death is and the idea of creating an image. And that's really an important point here, because that's what I'm hoping to accomplish, that at the end of this presentation, you will have an idea, and perhaps many ideas, of how to create an image that will help us. In Jung here quotes, Jung calls the archetype of death an archetype rich in secret life. And Jung urges us to go beyond the known framework. He says the boundaries of the reason can be far too narrow. And therefore, to use imagination is very, very important, and that would be the extension of what actually exists, but extending it into the other realm, so to speak. Let's see. We are all in the same boat. We are all traveling in the same direction. I believe, as Jung stated, it is better to have a myth, a story, a personal vision of what the final transformation may bring. And Jung is saying that our attitude is very important. And if we sincerely have a connection to something that we truly believe in, that is what will carry us through. That will be the ship that carries us, the boat that carries us to the other side. So to personalize our journey, to call an image forth, to evoke an image, as these two fairy tales do, is an example for us. Perhaps the final encounter does not have to be a terrifying experience, but instead a journey into an unknown reality with an image that evokes something familiar and helpful. Death is inevitable, just as childbirth is inevitable if a child is to be brought into the world. Childbirth is a terrifying experience, as the how and what happens during childbirth in individual case is unknown. In not that distant past, childbirth ended in death of a mother in 1 of 100 cases, and in Middle Ages in 1 in 20 cases. Death can be seen as an adversary, similar to the figure of devil, or death can be seen as an ally, as it is expressed in both fairy tales. The two tales bring forth an idea of death as a mentor, an ally, and a friend. And they help us from the beginning in our spiritual journey. The structure of the presentation is following. The first thing we will do, we will have Chuck read the tale of Godfather Death, Then I will read the tale of Godmother Death. Then I will take a few minutes to explain some few Jungian concepts. Then I will compare the two fairy tales, and I have slides for that. And then I will go to psychological interpretation of the tale into details. And after that, I have some images of death from different cultures. And if we have time, and I hope we will, I have a dream from my client who is 96 years old. And in that dream, there is a death image. So that's the plan. And let's see. Okay, so I chose these tales because they are close parallel to each other and they are relatively simple. And reading these tales out loud enhances the immersion in the material. So please note the different developments in these two tales. And I hope you enjoy listening to this tale. So if I could ask Chuck to do the reading, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Godfather Death. Poor man had 12 children and was forced to work night and day to give them even bread. When, therefore, the 13th came into the world, he knew not what to do in his trouble, but ran out into the great highway and resolved to ask the first person whom he met to be godfather. The first to meet him was the god, who already knew what filled his heart, and said to him, "Poor man, I pity thee. I will hold thy child at its christening, and will take charge of it, and make it happy on earth." The man said, "Who art thou?" "I am God." "Then I do not desire to have thee for a godfather," said the man. "Thou givest to the rich, and leavest the poor to hunger." Thus spoke the man, for he did not know how wisely God apportions riches and poverty. He turned therefore away from the Lord and went farther. Then the devil came to him and said, "What seekest thou? If thou wilt take me as a godfather for thy child, I will give him gold in plenty and all the joys of the world as well." The man asked, "Who art thou?" "I am the devil." "Then I do not desire to have thee for godfather," said the man. "Thou deceivest men and leadest them astray." He went onwards, and then came Death, striding up to him with weary legs, and said, "Take me as godfather." The man asked, "Who art thou?" "I am Death, and I make all equal." Then said the poor man, "Thou art the right one. Thou takest the rich as well as the poor, without distinction. Thou shalt be godfather." Death answered, "I will make thy child rich and famous, for he who has me for a friend can lack nothing." The man said, "Next Sunday is the christening. Be there at the right time." Death appeared as he had promised, and stood godfather quite in the usual way. When the boy had grown up, his godfather one day appeared and bade him go with him. He led him forth into a forest and showed him a herb which grew there, and said, "Now shalt thou receive thy godfather's present. I make thee celebrated physician. When thou art called to a patient, I will always appear to thee. If I stand by the head of the sick man, thou mayest say with confidence that thou wilt make him well again. And if thou givest him of this herb, he will recover. But if I stand by the patient's feet, he is mine. And thou must say that all remedies are in vain, and that no physician in the world could save him. But being of using the herb against my will, or it might fare ill with thee." It was not long before the youth was the most famous physician in the whole world. He had only to look at the patient, and he knew his condition at once, and if he would recover or needs must die. So they said of him, and from far and wide people came to him, sent for him when they had anyone ill, and gave him so much money that he soon became a rich man. Now it so befell that the king became ill, and the physician was summoned, and was to say if recovery were possible. But when he came to the bed, Death was standing by the feet of the sick man, and the herb did not grow which could save him. If I could but cheat Death for once, thought the physician, he is sure to take it ill if I do, but as I'm his godson, he will shut one eye. I will risk it. He therefore took up the sick man and laid him the other way, so that now Death was standing by his head. Then he gave the king some of the herb, and he recovered and grew healthy again. But Death came to the physician, looking very black and angry, threatening him with his finger, and said, "Thou hast overreached me. This time I will pardon it, as thou art my godson. But if thou venturest it again, it will cost thee thy neck, or I will take thee thyself away with me." Soon afterwards, the king's daughter fell into a severe illness. She was his only child, and he wept day and night. So he began to lose the sight of his eyes. He caused it to be made known that whosoever rescued her from death should be her husband and inherit the crown. When the physician came to the sick girl's bed, he saw Death by her feet. He ought to have remembered the warning given by his godfather, but he was so infatuated by the great beauty of the king's daughter and the happiness of becoming her husband that he flung all thought to the winds. He did not see that Death was casting angry glances on him, that he was raising his hand in the air and threatening him with his withered fist. He raised up the sick girl and placed her head where her feet had lain. Then he gave her some of the herb, and instantly her cheeks flushed red and life stirred afresh in her. When Death saw that for a second time he was defrauded of his own property, he walked up to the physician with long strides and said, "All is over with thee, and now the lot falls on thee," and seized him so firmly with his ice-cold hand that he could not resist, and led him into a cave below the earth. There he saw thousands and thousands of candles were burning in countless rows, some large, others half-sized, others small. Every instant, some were extinguished, and others again burnt up, so the flames seemed to leap hither and thither in perpetual change. "See," said Death, "these are the lights of men's lives. The large ones belong to children, the half-sized ones to married people in their prime. The little ones belong to old people. The children and young folks likewise have only a tiny candle. Show me the light of my life," said the physician, and he thought that it would still be very tall. Death pointed to a little end, which was just threatening to go out, and said, "Behold, it is there." "Ah, dear godfather," said the horrified physician, "light a new one for me. Do it for love of me, that I may enjoy my life, be king and the husband of the king's beautiful daughter." "I cannot," answered Death. "One must go out before a new one is lighted." "Then place the old one on a new one that will go on burning at once when the old one has come to an end," pleaded the physician. Death behaved as if he were going to fulfill his wish and took hold of a tall new candle. But as he desired to revenge himself, he purposely made a mistake in fixing it, and the little piece fell down and was extinguished. Immediately, the physician fell on the ground, and now he himself was in the hands of Death.
Wow. Thank you very much. Well, let me read the Polish version. They called Godmother Death, or I called it Godmother Death. A very poor peasant had a sixth child born to him and his wife. When it came to a baptism, nobody in his village wanted to be godparents to his child. For a godfather, he asked a church beggar, but all the village women refused to take on the role of a godmother. The man walked to the main dirt road leading to other villages to find someone he could ask to be a godmother. He didn't see any women he could ask. At the end of the day, tired, hungry, and dispirited, he sat on a stone next to the dirt road and cried. A beautiful figure, all in white, appeared on his right and lightly touched him on the shoulder. In a sonorous voice, the figure said, "Don't despair, I will be a godmother to your child." The peasant bowed his head and said, "Thank you for the good words, but who are you?" "I am your guardian angel." The peasant thought for a moment and responded politely but decisively, "Thank you, but no, it will not do." "Why is that?" surprised angel asked. "For so many years you were watching me with indifference, as I was starving and suffering, and not once have you helped me. It's clear you are an unjust and unfair being. I don't want to have a relationship with someone like you." Ashamed, the angel walked away and the peasant continued his waiting. The sun was setting, the day was over. Disheartened, the peasant started walking home. To make it back home before dark, he took a cross-country shortcut, which led him by a swamp and marshland. When he got across the wetlands, he heard from behind a voice calling for help. "Human, have pity, help me out of this bog." He looked back and saw an old woman submerged in the mud up to her hips. She could not move an inch. It was dangerous for him to enter the swamp, but he had a good heart and an understanding of human misfortune. He wondered how was it that he did not see the woman when he was passing by. He continued wading into the deep bog to reach her. When he reached her, he saw that it would be easiest to carry the woman out on his back. She agreed to that. Once she was on his back, he was surprised that she hardly weighed anything. She was just bones and skin. When they got to the dry land, he asked her if she would become a godmother for his child. She said yes, but she added, "You may not want me when I tell you who I am. I am Death." The man was not afraid. He took off his hat and with reverence bowed low in acknowledgement of her non-human power and thanked her for the honor. She said to him, "I see that you are not afraid." He said, "Why should I be afraid? Sooner or later, I must meet with you. Isn't it much better that when I see you the second time, I meet you as my comrade? Besides, nobody else in the world has the honor to have Death as a godmother to their child." "Seems like you like me," laughed Death. "Why is that?" He answered, "Because you are the most just being in the whole world. You treat a king like you treat a beggar. I hold that in highest regard." Death gave him money to pay for the priest and to invite villagers to the feast. At the christening, Death appeared to the villagers not as an ostentatiously rich person. However, all felt her power and gravity, and that made them quiet and keeping their distance. Afterwards, Death asked the peasant what would he like to commemorate this occasion. He thought for a long time. At last, Death suggested that she can come in 100 years to get him. The peasant responded with affright, "How could I live through so many years of suffering and poverty? No, come in 25 years. By then, my children will be all grown and able to provide for themselves. I will be in peace to live this life. Death agreed, then gave him a gift of telling people in sickness whether they are going to live or die. If I am in the corner of the room, the patient will be better in a week. If I am at the feet, within a month. If I am at the head, there's nothing that can be done. They are ready to go with me. Using that knowledge, the man became a famous healer. After 20 years of good life, the man started to worry about the approaching visit from death. He thought of ways to escape death. He had a bed constructed with a mechanism with which he could quickly turn the bed around. Death came at the appointed time and stood at the head of his bed. He quickly rotated the bed. Death said, "Oh, that is very clever of you. I'm not going to play games with you. I'm not going to chase after you." "Does it mean I can live longer?" the man asked with hope. Death said in cold voice, "You can live 300 years, but consider that from now on, you will not have the gift of predicting who gets better and who is to die. Sooner or later, you will lose all your money and you will be poor and helpless. You will be a lonely and sick old man. All people you know, your family, your friends will be gone, and you will be alone, and nobody will know you or need you. Nobody will understand you." With that, Death left the room. The man jumped from the bed and ran after Death, calling, "Wait, I'm coming with you. I understand now what a bliss a long life like that would bring." When he came to her, she embraced him gently to her bony chest and carried him to the beyond. Now, at the very end, there is a word that I couldn't quite translate. When Death embraces him gently, the Polish word is przytulić, and that's a word used by a mother to her child. That's kind of tenderness and love that is expressed in that term. I just wanted to mention now because the ending is clearly very different from the version we just heard in the Godfather, in this other tale, in this Grimm's fairy tale. All right. So back to the PowerPoint. I will go and just briefly explain a couple terms. Did it work?
Well, we're seeing your notes.
Oh, okay. Well, then I will exit and try again. That's the one. How about now?
That's good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I am sure you all are very well versed in these terms and are familiar with these terms, but I just thought I will very briefly go over it. In particular, I really like the description of the unconscious as nature herself. And because we are part of nature, we are all embedded in nature, and we are surrounded in nature by nature. So you know, when the ego thinks that we are separate in control, that's sort of a necessary illusion for the ego not to be overwhelmed and to feel in control. And when it comes to the archetypes, what really stands out to me is their numinosity and autonomy. And these two give life to formation of a particular psychological complex. At the bottom of a psychological complex is usually an archetype. The complex is rooted in an archetype. So remembering that the reason why we sometimes identify with a complex would be the fact that they are numinous and that they have their own energy. I also came across a quote where Jung talks about the unconscious being the alien. So the ego, I think it's really important to think of the ego as the manager of consciousness, but it's the here and now in this realm. And then the outside of the ego is the unconscious, and that's the outside of the ego, and both earlier and later and before and after, because the unconscious does not keep a chronology. So so when we talk about fairy tales, this is very useful, because the fairy tales, as well as dreams, they represent the picture outside of the ego. I also want to emphasize that the ego is the child of the unconscious, and yet during our development, the idea is for the ego to become independent of the unconscious, to be able to not be overwhelmed by the unconscious, and later, of course, the ego, the idea in Jungian psychology is for the ego to form a relationship with the self, and that's also emphasized in this tale, and I will talk more about it as we go. So, but because the language of fairy tales and dreams is this language that doesn't recognize necessarily the material rules and physical rules of our world and the chronology of our world, the language is difficult for the ego to and sometimes we will dismiss, for example, dreams or even fairy tales as because we don't understand them, because we don't understand the language, and that's what we study, symbolism connected to images, to bring us some information on what the fairy tale, what the dream might be talking about. As I said, the part of growing and development for the ego is to form a relationship with the self, the unconscious part of ourselves, the large being, the godlike image. Self is represented frequently by different by squares and by circles. So the intersection of ego, the relationship between the ego and the self, is of particular importance, because what we really want is for the ego to become aware of the self, of this archetypal energy that exists, and that we can get connected to it at times, and hopefully not identify with it. So create a healthy relationship with it. And we call this work a process of individuation. And now I would like to go to the comparisons. So here are the differences in the two tales. I thought this may be helpful to just visually see it. So the most important, well, the first difference is that death is masculine, and in the Grimm's fairy tale, and death is feminine in the Polish fairy tale. And I will talk about that. I will go back to it in a moment. And then how the figures, what figures appear at the crossroads. So again, in Grimm's, we have all three figures appear, God, devil, and death. And in the Polish version, only guardian angel appears, and death is met in at the swamp. The relationship that is formed in Grimm's fairy tale, the relationship that is really formed is with the godchild. And in Polish fairy tale, the relationship stays with the father. The gender of the child stays unknown. Now, when it comes to the healing part, death stands at the feet and gives the young man an herb. In the Polish version, death stands at the head, and there is this differentiation that if death stands in the corner, it will take 1 week for the patient to feel better. If death stands at the feet, 1 month is specified. When it comes to breaking of the agreement, we see that in the Grimm's fairy tale, the young man, that is called physician, is disobedient. He breaks the rule, and first there's the king, and then there's the princess, and it's explained by infatuation, both with the beauty, power, and wealth. In the Polish version, death offers 100 years to the man, but the man asks only for 25 years. At the end, the man attempts to trick the death. Going back to the Grimms, man begs for his life at the end, and there's the image of candle, and death is the trickster, and death is the one who has ice-cold hands. On the other side, death describes dismal future to the man. Death leaves, and man chooses to run after death, and at the very end, there's gentle embrace, and death carries him into the beyond. And the big reversal that we see is at the feet and at the head. Now, I wanted to, let's see. So, as I already intimated, Jungian psychology pays attention to opposites. The process of individuation is a process of bringing opposites together. In these two tales, birth and death are brought together at the very beginning, just as they belong together in life, as they are points of demarcation, birth a point of entry, death a point of departure. Both tales begin with the problem of baptism of the newborn child and with the difficulty of finding a godparent. In the Grimm's version, a godfather is needed. There's no mention of who the godmother is. In the Polish version, a godmother is needed. For a godfather, a church beggar was secured. The peasants in both tales suffer from extreme poverty, and the village people refuse to enter in more relationship with them. In the old tradition, the ritual of baptism brought a small village community together. After the ritual, a feast for all attending followed. Thus, baptism was not just a church ceremony, but an event where a new member of the community was welcomed by all. Baptism brings into focus a spiritual aspect of our being. It symbolizes a spiritual growth, spiritual birth. From that point of view, baptism can be seen as a protection against death, since the initiation grants the soul a spiritual entry to the eternal afterlife. I just want to say a few words about the Christian custom of baptism. The purpose of baptism as a religious rite is to cleanse the spirit from impurity and restore purity to a newborn man. Baptism led to erasure of the original sin. Water is used in this rite. It is either sprinkled or poured over the head. Immersion in water is also used. A famous baptism was that of Jesus by John the Baptist in the River Jordan. Looking at the symbolic, at the water symbolically, water is a life-sustaining substance. Life emerged out of water. In fairy tales and myth, there is water of life that had healing properties. To this day, a custom of dousing females with water on Easter Monday is a popular practice in Poland as a celebration of renewal of life and as a fertility rite. In the context of this presentation, I just want to say that water is used again for initiation, and we could say for waking up the eternal soul and for bringing it forth. For those who are not familiar with what the role of godparents is, let me just say that a godparent is a person who presents a child at baptism and promises to take responsibility for their religious education. Typically, there are two godparents, a godmother and a godfather. Now, the Polish language has a very different term for this institution of godparents, and it's in this, and this shows in the title of this fairy tale too, and the name, the word is used kuma or pokumacją, and the old understanding of this was that when one became a godparent, that formed a lifelong relationship of friendship, comradeship, and implied mutual support. In modern times, this is used in a with more negative connotation and it goes beyond relationship of godparent and parents of the child. So psychologically, baptism represents initiation into spiritual development. Human psyche yearns to relate to the archetypal dimension, the transpersonal dimension, which allows our psyche to grow beyond the material world we live in. It gives our lives meaning and peacefulness. Jung wrote that sometimes gods stood in the place of the human godparents, just as the godparents stood in for the parents. Sometimes the gods themselves, just like in this tale, death is standing as in one tale as Godfather and in the other as a Godmother. Okay, so going back to the fairy tales. At the very, very beginning, it tells us that in Grimm's fairy tale, the child is number 13. I mean, one can ask why 13? Well, number 13 is 12 plus 1. 12 represents a totality, a dozen. 13 is going beyond the totality. It's going beyond allowed time. Therefore, it was considered hybris and a sin and an unlucky number. Even in our contemporary times, number 13 is avoided. As you know, in many hotels, floor number 13 doesn't exist because of this belief that number 13 is unlucky. On the other hand, number 13 also represented Jesus and the 12 apostles. In tarot cards, card number 13 represents death. And I will show you the image a little bit later. The fairy tale, the Grimm's fairy tale tells us that when the 13th child grew up, he received the gift from death, which made him a famous physician. However, because of his behavior, he lost his life early. So we can say that he was unlucky, that he belonged to death from the very beginning. Now, I will exit PowerPoint. In the Polish version, the child was number 6. Number 6 is considered a perfect number because it represents a hexagon, a circle divided into 6 equal parts. Therefore, number 6 also represents God. Number 5 represents the natural man with his instincts. And number 1 represents the creative principle, the creator himself. Therefore, 5 plus 1, we have this perfect union of human and the divine. As we learn from the tale, this child indeed brought luck to his father. The father's fortune was changed completely due to the meeting with death, and death agreeing to become a godmother. Due to that fateful encounter, the father became a well-known healer and a rich man. We do not know whether the child in this tale is female or male. So the first thing that in both tales, the fathers, the poor peasants do is to go out of the village looking for someone that they could ask to become the godparent. In both fairy tales, the peasant leaves the village to seek a chance encounter with an unknown person. Leaving the known place to go to a new place could be described as going into liminal space, in the in-between space, and it is akin to entering the unconscious. Moreover, the act of venturing and sitting at the roadside and waiting can be seen as act of invocation. The peasants are waiting for someone who can be asked to be a godparent, but from the transpersonal perspective, it can be viewed as summoning deities, as petitioning for help and support. Psychologically, we could say the person is calling for help from the inner psyche, from the self. As we see, the calling upon the spiritual realm works. Spiritual figures appear. And as a result of this divine intervention, the lives of the peasants become forever changed. In the Polish tale, the peasant cries. In many fairy tales, crying is significant. In the myth of Eros and Psyche, Psyche cries each time she was faced with impossible tasks she could not accomplish by herself. Each time, help from the unconscious arrived. The peasant cried while sitting on the stone next to the road from the despair and frustration. Crying in the open makes a person very vulnerable. crying creates an emotional openness. In the fairy tale, it seems like a darkest moment. The day was ending and the man didn't find one person to ask to be godmother. Symbolically, crying signifies an ablution, purifying and cleansing. It washes off frustration of the day and erases the feeling of failure. Psychologically speaking, crying creates psychic openness, which then prepares the ground for an important transformative encounter, an encounter with an archetypal figure from the unconscious. So the figures that I met at the road, the first figure in Grimm's fairy tale is God. And God says, I will hold thy child at its christening and will take charge of it and make it happy on earth. And the man said, thou givest to the rich and leavest the poor to hunger. It is strange that God says he will make the child happy on earth, since it would seem that God's concern should be with the spiritual life of the child and ensuring eternal life of his soul in heaven. The devil says, I will give him gold and all the joys of the world as well. The man said, thou deceivest men and leadest them astray. So, the promise the devil makes is consistent with what the devil symbolizes to us: preoccupation with material possessions and overindulgence of sensuality. The third figure that approached was death. The death said, I will make your child rich and famous. For he who has me for a friend can lack nothing. Now, it's a mystery why the peasant refused God's offer to be a godfather. Perhaps it's worthwhile to look into what was going on when Grimms were collecting the tales in the 19th century and what was happening earlier that perhaps found its way into the tales. So in 18th centuries, Voltaire was writing and he was in particular voicing his disapproval of the Catholic Church and perhaps some and equality, and perhaps some of this of his writings found a way to the popular found way to be known among even the peasants. So in any case, what the peasant is voicing, his disapproval of the existing status quo, tells us that the peasant had some awareness of the social injustice, and that's development in consciousness. And of course, he chose death for a godfather because that makes us all equal. So again, this idea of equality comes from France. On the other hand, from a Jungian point of view, we could say that the Christian God represents all good and as such lacks darkness. But we do have the second figure represented here by the devil. But God and devil are split apart. It seems wise not to go with either figure, as they represent, one represents the all-powerful and all-good, and the other figure represents evil and darkness. By not entering into relationship with either of these powerful figures, the peasant suddenly avoids inflation and also experience of being split. In the Polish fairy tale, only a guardian angel appears. The angel only offers to be a godmother. No promises of wealth or good life were made. In parallel to Grimm's version, the peasant tells the angel that she is uncaring and an unjust being who passively watched him starve and suffer. The guardian angel as an archetypal figure, and as the name indicates, supposed to guard and protect a human from accidents and making wrong choices. From psychological perspective, it represents an inner part that, if activated, takes on the role of protector. People say, when avoiding a disastrous accident, my guardian angel must have been watching. It is an uncanny feeling when one is miraculously saved from the eye of the storm. Another name for this part could be the self. Psychologically speaking, this confirms that the peasant has no inner relationship with this part of his psyche. I'm talking about the guardian angel. Perhaps he never experienced caring, protective, and nurturing relationship in his life, and thus was unable to develop and envision such capacity in himself. What comes to mind is Jung's saying that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. The feeling of the indifference implies that no feeling relationship existed between the ego and the protective part. So in both fairy tales, death is the figure that is central in these tales. The word death is a masculine noun in German, der Tod. The word death in Polish, śmierć, is a feminine noun. In fairy tales, death, being an archetypal figure, can take on any gender and is symbolized by numerous images. Death in its feminine form represents an aspect of the Great Mother archetype. On one hand, she is a giver of life. On the other, she is the devouring mother, a life taker. According to Eric Newman, death was represented as feminine until Middle Ages. The change to masculine image of death seemed to occur during the long years of Black Plague. In my brief survey of figures representing death in other cultures, we will see that death is represented both as feminine and masculine. As a side, it is well-reported phenomenon, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that men call for their mothers at the moment of death, and that's across many cultures. In Grimm's version, the peasant father disappears. His son takes his place, and death appears to him when he becomes a young man. In the Polish version, the original peasant continues to be the main character. He is the one who establishes the comradeship with death. Now, the fateful moment in the Polish tale is, of course, related to this encounter meeting in the swamp. So the peasant crossed the swamp and reached the firm ground when he heard the voice calling from behind, saying, "Human, have pity, help me out of this bog." This form of address in Polish is saved for dire situations. It is an appeasement to a higher morality. Human, in Polish, człowieku, remember that you are human. Sometimes in moments of life and death, it is important to appeal to our shared humanity. It's almost like saying, wake up, human. Człowieku, opamiętaj się. I found that very important to mention. So the man, going back to the man in our fairy tale, he's very surprised to see this old woman half submerged in the mud, and she is apparently, seemingly immobilized. Of course, she's a goddess, she's death. So this is a kind of a test, whether the man is willing to risk his life and offer help. It's also very appropriate that as a mother goddess, she's earth, she is linked to the primordial mud. That is sort of her ground, her backyard, so to speak. The man carries her out to the dry land, and he carries her. And at the very end of the tale, we hear that death carries him to the other world, to the beyond. Swampland is an interesting area of representing fertile grounds where numerous biological processes are taking place. One of them would be decomposing of matter in water. Alchemical dissolving takes place in swamplands, a dissolving that provides rich nutrients to new organic life. The primordial ooze is where life started. It seems right that death, the embodiment of the Great Mother in her life-taking aspect, appears as half immersed in the primordial mud. Once the peasant learns who death is, his behavior is very humble. He's respectful. He with reverence bends down, bringing his head down to the ground. The attitude of respect and reverence is represented in this behavior, and it also is represented in many fairy tales. And the fate of the hero frequently depends on this attitude of the hero. We have tales where two stepsisters, first the good stepsister, the hardworking stepsister goes into the woods in the underworld, and she's very respectful of the figure there and does the tasks that are required of her. And when she's done, she goes back and brings back a treasure. And when it comes to the stepsister that is spoiled and arrogant, and she doesn't care, she doesn't show respect, she doesn't do any work, she is, of course, she doesn't receive any reward, and in fact, she gets a punishment. The peasant in Polish tale knows about human adversity and misfortune. It's mentioned that he has a good heart, in contrast to description of death as one whose heart never beats. That's from Jung's Red Book. Or who has an iron heart. That's in other fairy tales. The peasant, as I said, is humble, respectful, helpful, and he's courageous. Why aren't you afraid of me? Death asks. He's also very thoughtful. He takes time when Death inquires what he would wish for. So, as I mentioned, to give assistance in a fairy tale is an indication that it will go better for the main character. As I said, it is a sort of a test. Is the main character going to ignore the call for help, or is the character of good heart and is worthy to receive help later? Let me talk a little bit about the gift of years. to put it in the context, we all know that time is the most precious gift. Death offers the peasant gift of 100 years, but he cannot envision living that long. His imagination is limited by the present circumstances, starvation and hard labor. And that is what Jung warned about. If we use reason to envision the future, that can be too limiting. One needs to be able to create a vision of one's future that is bigger than reason would dictate. I see that my time is getting short, so I'm going to just skip a lot of material here. Okay. The gift in Grimm's version, Death gave a gift to the godchild when he became a young adult. The Death said, if I am at the head of the bed, the man will get better. If I am at the feet of the man is mine. Death also gave the man an herb to use. But it is clear that the significance is the place death stands in relationship to the patient. So let's talk a little bit about what it means at the feet, the symbolism of that. Feet are essential for our walking, for our moving. They also provide connection to the earth. They ground us. Being upright, to be on one's feet, means to be active. We have 2 feet. Psychologically, we move forward towards consciousness 1 foot at a time. 1 foot still in the unconscious and the other already in consciousness. The symbolism of number 2 indicates possibility of something coming into consciousness. On the negative side, to be cut at the feet means to be defeated. To have feet of clay means there's no good foundation for movement. And when we say someone is bedridden, one cannot use one's feet at all. One is lying down. When we think of the meaning of what it means to be at the head is round. The skull is a vessel that holds and protects the brain. It's a container. In recent times, head is associated with reasoning and consciousness. Head being on top of our bodies represents the upper spiritual realm. On the negative side, to be in your head implies stuckness. You are thinking too much about something. Part of our head is our face. Face provides identity. We have a lot of face recognition, facial recognition used today. Face is one of the most sensitive areas of our body. It is recognized as intimate space. Eyes, ears, breathing, taste, and smell are all integral parts of the head, delivering information about our environment instantaneously. Thus, standing close to the head implies a very close, intimate connection and sensual awareness. I received several comments regarding at the feet and at the head position. Suggestion was made that the reversal of the 2 could be related to cultural differences between the 2 nations. It was pointed out to me that German culture tends towards pragmatism, technology, engineering, problem solving. It's more down to earth, versus Polish culture, which is romantic, idealistic, and looking to the stars. Going back to the Grimm's version, the important development in that tale is what happens when the young physician attends to the king. So he saw death standing by the feet, but he thought that he could cheat death for once. For sure, death would shut one eye because he is the godson. And indeed, he was right, even though death was very angry and said, "You have overreached, but I will pardon you this time. But be aware that if you do it again, it will cost you your neck." The second time, soon after, the princess fell ill, and the king announced that whoever heals her would get her for his wife and would get the crown. The physician came and saw the death standing at the feet, but was so infatuated with the great beauty of the princess that he flung all thoughts to the wind. The question is, why would the physician forget about warnings from death? And the tale says he became infatuated by the great beauty and the happiness of imagining happiness of becoming her husband. Falling in love at the first sight, the infatuation is a classical example of losing one's groundedness, of losing one's head, of falling into something beyond reason. The fact that with the marriage he was promised the crown is not to be missed. Here is the seduction by power. Crown is the symbol of the self. So it can be said he is becoming infatuated by his identification with the self archetype. He forgets that this is at the peril of his life. When he right after that, death appears and says, "Now the lot falls on thee," and with his ice cold hands seized him and took him to the cave below earth. So the first transgression was forgiven because he was the godchild, but the second transgression cannot be forgiven. It is interesting that because the princess got her life back, she is going to live, the young physician has to take her place. The lot falls on thee. In other mythologies, in particular in Sumerian mythology, Ereshkigal, who is the goddess of death, there is the same rule. When her sister Inanna was released from the underworld, she had to substitute another life for her place. It's nice to see how these things are universal, archetypal. The archetypes are universal. So we have the image of cave. The young man, this young physician is brought, death brings this man to a cave. Caves offered protection from elements and wild animals. They are dark and lead deeper into earth. Entrances to caves are frequently hidden. They are associated symbolically with womb of a mother and a tomb. All these aspects connect caves with the feminine. So psychologically speaking, we could say that death brings man back to the Great Mother. Now, there are candles everywhere. Candles are source of light and were, especially in our historical past, they were very important source of light. So we have this illumination of darkness. and therefore association to consciousness. And remember, at the very beginning, we have the man carrying the light. Life burning signifies continuation of life, just as we see in the tale. And when a candle is extinguished, it signifies the end of man's life. There is a dream that is quoted by von Franz of a woman who is close to her death. She's in her hospital bed, and she called the nurse to tell her that she just had a dream. And in this dream of this dying woman, she saw a candle burning on this side of the window, and then the candle went out. And a moment later, she saw the candle on the other side of the window. And that's sort of very moving image of how the psyche had created this image of continuation. In the Grimm's version, the man begs for a new candle to be lit, but Death says, no, that cannot be done. There are rules. And at the very end, Death behaves as though he was going to light a new candle, but then purposefully drops the small remnants of the candle and it goes out. So, here is the deception of Death. It's interesting that Death seemed to offer a glimpse of hope, but then snatches it away. Psychologically, we cannot predict behavior of archetypal figures. Trickstery seems to be uniformly represented in myth and fairy tales. Trickstery as characteristic of gods and archetypes. So ultimately, we can say death cannot be bargained with. It comes on its own terms. Let me also point out that the gift of death is not really an ability to heal. It is ability to see where death stands. And based on that, these two main characters were able to let the sick person know their fate. So we can say that the healer, physician, is de facto working for death because they announce to the patient what will happen, what their fate is. But they don't have any individual power to alter the situation. And when one of them attempts it, we see the negative consequences to his life. So I see that I'm running out of time. So I just quickly tell you the dream of my client who is 96 years old. And several months ago, she had this dream. Okay. I have to recall it in my mind. So in the dream, she is in a very large hall where the ceiling is so high that she doesn't see the ceiling. And across the hall, she sees her friend sitting there, a friend who has died several years ago. And at first she wants to go and say something to her friend, but then she notices that there is a small boy standing next to her. She does not know who this small boy is. And then she sees a few yards from her an old woman sitting, a very old woman sitting down. The next thing she notices in the dream is a figure coming from her right, a dark figure, and she thinks in the dream that it's the mother of the child. She asks the boy, "Do you know who this is?" And the boy says, "It's Death." The figure approaches the old woman that is sitting a few yards away, and as the figure gets close, it turns into a sphere of light and embraces this old woman. And when the light is gone, the woman is slumped down, dead. That's the dream. Now, in conclusion, both myth and the fairy tales presented here contain material from the unconscious about psychic development that, if noted, processed, and integrated, benefit and nurture the growth and enlargement of consciousness. Myths guide us. Myths carry vital meaning. It is helpful to have one's own myth regarding the meaning of our individual journey. One way to see it is that we are all on our own hero's journey. By observing our physical life and our psychic life, especially our psychic life, by noticing and considering our dreams, visions, insights, and synchronicities, we develop a relationship to the transcendent and to the infinite, to the self, to the God within. When we are in touch with the archetypal core of our being, we feel alive, and our life carries a meaning. Life and death are the opposites that need each other. Death embraces life. It is my hope that sharing these materials with you gives you some food for thought. I hope some of the images presented will stay with you in a positive way. There's a proverb in Polish that says something like, "The devil is not as terrifying as it is pictured." I take the meaning as, once you face something you're afraid of, it is not as bad as you fear makes you imagine it. I find it a good rule to follow. It is also my hope that introducing this material to you will inspire you to develop more dynamic relationship towards death and to talk with others in your life about it, not as a morose or depressing subject, but something to have curiosity about, something signifying transformation, not only an end, but also entering the unknown, beyond our reality. And remember, the best antidote to the fear of death is enjoyment of life, of living in the present moment, of noticing the beauty, however small, of this reality. Thank you.
Thank you. There were so many different symbols in those stories. You covered as many of them, I guess, as you could. So if people have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function. We do have a lot of time left, actually. So Kornelia, if you wanted to expand some more.
Oh, yes, I can show you, but I think questions would be welcomed, of course, and maybe if we still have time, I will share the images with you from those other different cultures.
Okay, so here's a first question is from Roman Rogulski.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Kornelia. And perhaps as you've recognized, okay, ja też jestem Polakiem, but I was raised in English and everything else, okay, but I have a very close contact with Polish culture. And so thank you very, very much for bringing this Polish fairy tale, to which I feel a much stronger affinity than I do the Grimm's one. Just very rapidly, I would really love it to be able to get the Polish text, if that is at all possible. Maybe we can do that at some other point. But the one comment that I wanted to make was I really felt an affinity to the Polish peasant, okay, who has this, who says, you know, the guardian angel, you haven't done anything for me. The image, the symbolism of going and rescuing death from the swamp. I was thinking of James Hollis, The Swamplands of the Soul. Peasants live in the swamplands of the soul. And then this Polish peasant had a very, very good heart, because he went and didn't think of himself. He thought of the other. And so that he, you know, so there was this kind of redeeming feature. You know, the term, we live in a vale of tears and sorrows, okay? And that kind of depicts the life of the Polish peasant. My stepfather was a Polish peasant. I'm very, very, very intimately acquainted with the hardships of life. You were talking about the candle and how the candle represents death. And I love that image, the story from Marie-Louise von Franz. But I was also thinking of Elton John and that beautiful song that he was singing to Marilyn Monroe, and then he used it for Lady Diana, The Candle in the Wind. Your candle burned out long before your legend ever did. And then I just wanted to mention one other item. Okay, you brought in that dream at the very end, and Dr. Christopher Kerr has been working for about 25, 30 years in New York in a palliative sense, and he wrote this wonderful, wonderful book, and there's images on YouTube as well, Death is But a Dream, where he collects visions and dreams of people in their final stages of life, and it is really, really powerful images, as powerful as the one that Marie-Louise von Franz brought to the dying person. And then one final thing, better the devil that you know than the one you don't. Thank you so much. Those are some comments that came to mind. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cornelia, perhaps if you you could send me the Polish text, and I could, because I have everybody's email address. I
Sure.
could send that to Roman.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, we have Dennis Merritt.
Yes, thank you. Certainly, it's very thought provocative, especially for older people like myself. It's the main theme in both of them was so interesting, in that the protagonist was given the ability, or was shown basically what a person's fate would be, whether they would live or die. And it seems like that's one of the basic themes for the tale, is like being able to accept your fate. He didn't, in the Grimm's tale, he didn't want God to be the Godfather, because God kind of favored the wealthy, if you will. So it's like not accepting your economic fate. And then in the Polish tale, not accepting, if you will, your personal image of God, because what have you done for me? So it's kind of like the issue of fate. And I have a lot of trouble being from a rather poor background myself, and dealing with politics here in America with the whole idea of income inequality. So I try to put that aside. But so what he both of them got a lot of wealth and recognition by being able to know what a person was going to live or die at that crucial moment when they were ill. But then not when it came to yourself and accepting your fate. That's where it tripped them up. The first one, okay, power, the princess, and so on, but not accepting that like I said, that the personal fate seemed to be the issue. So I'm wondering if you could say some more about that or elaborate on that message.
Interestingly enough, I've recently heard a person who works in an ambulance, and that person said that what he hears very frequently is the patient begging, please rescue, please save my life. Please don't let me die. So that's really interesting that, I mean, it's one way to look at it is that we are not really prepared to die, which is interesting because we do not know our fate. Any moment can be the moment of our death, and not to be prepared for it, especially as we are aging, that is not to come to terms with it. I'm not sure that one can prepare for it, but sort of coming to terms with it. To me, that's what's essential, to see it as the journey. I mean, for me personally, that's what's what speaks the most, is that this life is a journey, and it has to come to an end.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay,
our
okay,
culture
go
has
ahead.
great difficulty with the acceptance of that, of seeing the end as perhaps a new beginning. Perhaps. Go ahead.
Before we go to the next person, I'm just going to put a plug in for Dennis. Speaking of dreams, Dennis is going to be giving us a talk. Dennis, who just made those comments, he's going to be giving us a talk on dreams of his patients that included the I Ching. He gave us a talk on the I Ching over a year ago. So that's that'll be next January. Okay, Susan Chamberlain is next.
Yes, I'd like to know if we could possibly see some more of the images of death. That seems to be, so much is determined by the images that we see, and to couple those with the stories that we read and that we've heard seems to be, it's a really enriching process. So I was hoping we'd get to see a few more images.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I can just find it in my notes. Okay, I go to power sharing. I mean to screen sharing.
Thank you.
And I wanted to share this picture first,
Yes.
because it's not a cave, but it's a Polish cemetery, and this happens every year on November 1st.
Oh.
Now, what's interesting about this picture, there are no humans, as you see. Usually, they are totally they're so full that you can hardly move through. This is the year of pandemic, 2020. Some people were able to come in at a appointed time and light candles, but then they had to leave. That's why you don't see any people. But the sea of candles, it's November 1st is a very important holiday in Poland. All right, so I want to see how. I want to go to this picture. Okay, just go. Okay. Yeah. So this is Hinduism, the goddess Kali. So notice her bloody knife and the necklace of skulls and the skirt of hands.
Mhm.
Okay, she was associated with violence and sexuality. And she was a very terrifying being. And in Sanskrit, her name meant she who is black, or she who is death. Then we go the next one. Oh, I think I've skipped one. Yes, I did skip one. Okay, this image, this is Ereshkigal that I briefly mentioned. Ereshkigal comes from Babylonia, Sumeria, and she was the queen of the underworld, which was called Kur. And the famous story is of Inanna, her sister, the queen of heaven, descending into the underworld. And we don't have time to tell you the whole story. I'm sure you've heard presentations regarding that. This is an Egyptian image, and it's the weighing, this weighing of the soul, of the weighing of the heart, sometimes it's called. So the underworld is called Duat, and the judge here was god Anubis. And it is said that the soul, the heart, was weighted against a feather. And if the soul or the heart was heavier than the feather, then a devourer of the soul, Amit, would get the soul, or in other versions, the soul was thrown back into the lake of fire. This is from Greek. The distorted picture, this is distorted because it comes from a vase, and we see Hades and Persephone. Hades was, of course, the king of the underworld, and Persephone was his wife. And you probably all know the story of Persephone's abduction. But they also were judges appointed by Zeus, and you may have heard those names. Radamantis and Iakos were the two judges, and then there was a third one who, if these two could not agree on something, the third one would, Minos, would solve would make the final judgment. And the souls went either to the Isle of the Blessed, or they went to Tartarus, which was the underworld place. Another figure related to death is Thanatos, and this is a picture of Hypnos and Thanatos. They are brothers. The one that is in the foreground is Hypnos, god of sleep, and behind him is Thanatos. And he was the one who was said to have heart of iron, and apparently he was merciless and indiscriminate. But occasionally, people were able to unwit him. Very occasionally, they were, of course, like in particular, thinking of Sisyphus, who was, of course, then punished.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's see. Here we have the three fates of the three Moirai, and Lothor, the spinner, who span the thread of life. And then we have Lachesis, who measures the thread of life. And the third one is Atropos, the one who cuts the thread of life. So in Christianity, we have Archangel Michael, and we can see that he's weighing souls of people on a scale on the Judgment Day. This depiction shows up early in Christianity, but it is not mentioned in the Bible. So a few more images. Here's an image from Rembrandt. This is Satan, but look how much like death he looks. So
Mhm.
it's Satan, the temptation of Jesus, drawing by Rembrandt. Here's the card 13, tarot card 13 that I mentioned
Mhm.
earlier in the presentation, and you can see the heads. You know, the cut off head symbolizes loss of consciousness, and cut off feet and hands. The feet, loss of the standpoint, and together with cut off hands, loss of ability for any activity. And you can also see that they are used, the appendages on the ground are meant to be fertilizers for new life. And here, this is from Dürer, a woodcut from Dürer, the night and death with the hourglass. A very, very famous image. I'm sure you all have seen it many times. And this image comes from a book called, from a fairy tale book called Vasilisa the Brave. It's a Russian fairy tale, and the illustrator is Kinuko Kraft. I just love that picture of, this is a Baba Yaga from Eastern Europe, the figure from many fairy tales from that region. You can see, this is a very archetypal figure in my mind. Very powerful. And here another image from a different version, of Vasilisa the Brave. You can see the hat behind her is standing on the chicken leg. You see the chicken leg there? That's the famous hat of the Baba Yaga. And you can see the skulls used as the sources of light. And the last image that I have is the sphere, the luminous sphere that I thought brings to mind the sphere from my client's dream. So with that, are there more questions?
Yeah, we have Bruce Gordon.
Hello.
Hello.
I had a couple of observations, and then I'd like to ask a question related to them. I was really struck by the similarity in that Kali figure in the death image. And you pointed out that death is associated with the number 13, or being outside of life, as is Christ in a sense, but also the Magdalene and the shamanic presence. And 4 is the generative number, or the number of completion of individuation. So if you break that down into 3 and 1, you get a kind of new formulation for what we're here to do. And my sensation, I do appreciate all of the ways that we approach these tales and myths as messages for the common man, and especially since they're set among the peasantry. But I think there's a further message, a kind of meta message for those among us who might take on a more shamanic role. So that if you go through the swamp, and if you're not afraid of the swamp, and you've left your fixation on life behind, so you're willing to risk that to help an unknown person in the swamp, which is how death tests whether we are beyond her, as in la mort, you know, her, the way she might cow us from being what we were meant to be. And so she offers us, either in the anticipated birth of perhaps a shamanic presence in the village who would be the 13th, or in the sense of a man who has had his 6th child and is now ready to move beyond the domestic sphere into a shamanic role. And that's number 6. While 13 would be the mem of regeneration, 6 is the Tipperet. And I believe these tales have a lot to do with Kabbalistic knowledge or Gnostic knowledge. So 6 would be the Tipperet of Venus, which is pure generation. So they are related. And in either case, and especially the latter, when he puts behind, you see, because he goes beyond the city pale to find support, because he knows support can no longer be found in the conventions of the human, which include the devil and God, and must now go to death directly to face the truth of this mortal coil because he sees beyond it. And so then the riddle becomes, are you willing to be a healer, perhaps at the cost of a foreshortened life or of suffering for that end? And there's a ambiguity about the response of these figures toward that prospect. But I think that's the higher level message of calling us into a healing and coordinating thing, no matter how poor we are. So hence the tzaddik, or the higher healer figure.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I really like that. Calling into shamanism, into new role.
And I think sometimes we see Jung more as interested in personal individuation, as if we can always thrive in our context, versus those who would change the context and who would address a new reality as healers, but also healers of the human condition, and be in themselves stand in for vision. So if you can see death in his workings, and you don't carry the herb as the Magdalene did. She was a miraphor, and so she was given this gift of healing, but it was also obviously a gift of understanding, of being a psychopomp and being able to carry people beyond death, and through also birth processes, which are like small deaths. So each of these stories is a tale of a death already happened, and how do we, within life, and how do we respond and reconstitute our lives in the higher light of that experience? Yeah. I love the imagery. I'm glad you got back to that. And the contrast of the two tales is really beautiful as a sort of bridge between levels of consciousness in my mind. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment.
And now we have another person with an Eastern European name, Lev Krasnoselsky. Did I get that right?
Thank you. Yes, excellent. Thank you, Dr. Grabinska. Yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and then really, Bruce, this is like, excellent, excellent observations, because it happens that I host biweekly fairy tale meetings, right? And we did this, group of fairy tales. It's like, in fact, like 12 or 13 variations of Godfather Death. An interesting thing there was that death is an alchemist of sorts, because in all these variations, like one component that is always there, besides all this, rejection of God as a, helper, devil as a helper, the helper, because they're different roles, right? Not in all the tales they're Godfather or Godmother, right? It was always this type of elixir of life that death produces, and that was like, ooh, this is like, common theme. So yeah, there is almost like several layers, right? Depending on what you want to find in those tales. But there is like, yeah, that's advice. That's like, my favorite one was a variation from Norway, which is titled The Boy with the Beer Keg. And this is not about like, college frat party, right? That's just like, similar setup. The boy is apprentice of a brewer, and brewer makes such a beautiful ale and pays the boy with a big keg of ale. And it's really heavy, so boy wants to have a drinking partner, so they can kind of like drink some of it, so it's easy to carry. And then the standard setup: reject the God, reject the devil, death is awesome, so they sit down and drink. And then death turns beer into this elixir of life, and then boy, becomes doctor, can give to patients. So yeah, it's just fascinating. Yeah, so figure I'll share that bit, once Bruce got into, additional components of what those tales can bring in. So yeah, thank you.
Do you think you could send me a list of those fairy tales that you were talking about?
I mean, I can certainly try to find you online. We don't have a chat enabled here.
Oh, if you,
But, you know.
You send it to me. You can send it to the, like the address that you got your Zoom link from, or, you know, any, whatever communication you got from us about this, just reply to that and it'll come to me and then I'll send it on to Kornelia.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. I mean, this is like, you know, publicly available. There's like a beautiful website that's hosted by University of Pittsburgh. It's got a list of like millions of, you know, fairy tales classified by Ernie Thompson type, you know. So it was this professor, I don't know, you know, pronunciation his name, Ashleyman, right? So he was a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. So he's got, you know, a great collection on those tales. They classify by types, and like, you know, related type, for example, is Death Messenger, where in fact, this is like interesting because you know, Dr. Grabinska mentioned that death is a trickster. But, you know, I was wondering, like, you know, it's kind of interesting because death is not really like trickster, I think, right? In the tale that you shared, because death is more like, no, we got a gentleman agreement. You know, you don't cheat on me. So
Yeah.
death is not trickster in that way, but like Death Messenger types, right? Death does something else. Death is like tells people, you know, like setup is there that death will let the person know when it's time for the person to go.
Right.
And when death shows up, person's like, wait a minute, what's going on? I never got any signs from you.
Right.
And death is like, are you stupid? You know, you are becoming weak, your, you know, hair fell out, your teeth fell out. These were the signs. You're just not paying attention. So, you know, in that group of tales, death is kind of trickster, you know, because it's kind of, yeah, I'll let you know, but there is this little small print, you know, what the signs are going to be. And that is not known to the other characters in the tales. So yes, it's, you know, it's just interesting to look at those related types, you know, because I think their death shows up as a trickster, you know.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you. Great, thanks.
I think that's it. And we've run over a bit. So thank you. Yeah, obviously this is a topic that could be expanded to many hours, but you did a great job of bringing it down to a more limited scope, and maybe we'll get more from you in the future. So thank you so much, and hope to see all of you at our June lecture. We don't have anything in May, but we do have that lecture on Kundalini on June 4th. So hope to see you all then, and bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.